Welcome everyone this afternoon to our guest lecture. So our speaker today is Jessica Clarke. I'm delighted to welcome you, Jessica. Jessica is a PhD candidate at University College London, and her research examines the comic mask in the late Roman Republic and early imperial period. And rather than studying literary sources, Jessica's research explores the visual record with the aim of re-evaluating the role of theatre within Roman socio-political culture. And we were just talking beforehand, and she's almost at the point of writing up, so best of luck for that. Jessica also told me that she's the project administrator and research support for a project entitled Fragments of Roman Republican Antiquarians, and that project is based in the UCL History Department. She's also worked on research projects associated with the British Museum, and that's very exciting, and has written for history publications such as the Ancient History magazine. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Jessica. Her talk today is entitled, there it is, The Comic Mask in Roman Popular Visual Culture. Jessica.
Thank you very much, Helen. So you can see my screen and the slides. Excellent. So first, thank you very much, Helen, for inviting me to speak today. I've participated in several of these really wonderful Belfast Classic Summer School programs over the past couple of years. So I'm really delighted to have been asked back to give a talk about my own research. As Helen mentioned, I'm a PhD student at UCL, where I'm pursuing what is essentially an interdisciplinary PhD between the History Department and the Archaeology Department. And I'm also, as Helen mentioned, employed at UCL as the administrative researcher on a project exploring the role of antiquarianism in the Roman Republic, where my principal supervisor is also the chief investigator on that project. So the purpose of my PhD is to research the image of the comic mask in the visual record of the Italic Peninsula from the late Republican period to the early Empire. My interest in this topic really began whilst I was working as a volunteer at the British Museum some years ago now, but I was working on a couple of exhibitions, one the Troy exhibition and the Nero exhibition. And whilst I was doing that, I was lucky enough to see behind the scenes at the museum and come across many objects relating to Roman theatre that are very seldom on display and also almost always entirely overlooked within the scholarship on the subject of Roman theatre. What really struck me while I was there was both the quality and the quantity of the material, and I therefore set about designing my research project in a way that would allow me to study the comic mask in all of the forms that I was seeing it be represented. The first stage of my research was therefore to create a database where I could catalogue the images of the comic mask that I was finding from across a wide time period from the ancient world. And I did this by creating a database that it's an online database and it's a relational database, and it allows me to have quantifiable and adaptable data as well as easy to view images. And it also allows me to continuously refine and expand the material that I'm working on as well. So rather than sort of published catalogues, having it online does give it this ability to continuously be expanding. Originally, it was a database designed on Microsoft Access, but I've recently migrated it to a different program called Airtable, which has a much more user-friendly interface. And that program will allow it to become open access in the future if that does become an option, which is something that I really hope that it does. I have included on this slide, just to give you a sense of what the database looks like. It does actually continue a lot further with a lot more columns, but just to give you an idea of how this data set looks, there is about 3,600 objects that I'm working with at the moment. And this includes objects from across the Mediterranean world, from a date range of about 2,500, a date range of 250 BC to 180 CE. The material that I'm focusing on in my thesis is between 150 BC and 50 CE, so from the late Republic to the early Empire, and amounts to about 1,800 objects overall. In my talk today, I would like to give you an introduction to this material. I'll present the key categories of objects on which we find the image of the comic mask represented, and also give you some of my sort of favorite examples from this category. Also examples that hopefully are quite representative of each category as well. The aim is to demonstrate both the breadth and the quantity of the material, and thus in doing so, the versatility of the comic mask as a decorative image, as well as hopefully demonstrating the significance of this image to the people of the Italic Peninsula. I will then close the talk just by giving an indication of how we can start to conceptualize this material and how we should start thinking about it as iconography. Before beginning, however, it is important to note that our modern sensibilities have led to the mask being one of the most misunderstood aspects of ancient drama from both theatre and classical studies. Not only are audiences often disquieted by masks, but also contemporary actors. The theatre director Peter Reynolds recalls that in rehearsals for a 1996 masked production of Oedipus, the performers were continually looking for motivations for their moves, a concern that he tried to convince them did not belong to masked theatre. He reported that many of the actors had quite a strong aversion to masks, including the lead actor, Alan Howard. The actress Judi Dench is reported as saying that she wished she had been part of the production, quote, until she remembered the masks and felt profoundly relieved that she wasn't. As Chris Vervain and David Wiles have pointed out, and this is a quote, "Our culture is extraordinary in its avoidance of the mask convention, and that avoidance has philosophical roots. To conceal the face is to conceal the self being the goal of modernist inquiry." Even the terminology of the English language reveals our attitude towards the mask and its role in concealment and disguise. And the term is thus implicitly acknowledges that human agency is being concealed by the mask. In the ancient world, the mask was an extraordinarily powerful image, both on the stage and in the visual record. An essential component of ancient performance, the mask is worth studying from the perspective of stagecraft, but also, as my thesis will argue, from the point of view of visual culture. The image of the comic mask has a long history, dating back to approximately the early 5th century BCE, and its appearance in the Roman visual record can be traced back to these early Greek origins. We see this image, however, move into the south of the Italian peninsula and then up through the peninsula around about the 2nd century BCE. As will hopefully become apparent through this talk, there is an extraordinary range of objects on which we can find the image of the comic mask, and thousands of extant examples which have the potential to provide insight into theatrical traditions and also the visual references of antiquity. So, what does this material comprise of? Across the Italian peninsula, the objects that display the image of the comic mask are many and varied, ranging from figurines of actors wearing comic masks to monumental masks decorating public buildings. The mask was a dominant image in the ancient world. Today, I will work through the material in order of the largest category to the smallest, the largest in terms of numbers rather than the size of the object. This ordering is somewhat arbitrary, as we are always dealing with the material that has survived. Quantitative archaeological statistics are highly susceptible to what has been excavated and published, and one extensive excavation can alter the picture quite substantially in terms of distribution and quantity. Sites such as Pompeii and Herculaneum, for example, provide a disproportionately large quantity of information, which is preserved under extraordinary circumstances, and we can only hypothesize as to whether these two towns are representative of the sort of material that might have existed elsewhere. However, the relative quantities of material can offer an interesting insight into the possible popularity of certain objects if it is handled quite carefully. So the first type of object that I want to talk about is intaglios. These are the most common object on which the comic mask is found during this period. These were small engraved glass paste beads and gemstones, worn as a ring or used as seal stones. Approximately 20 millimeters at the widest point, seal stones were used to sign documents as an authentic mark of the owner. A variety of evidence indicates that such sealstones were used by a wide cross-section of the Roman population, from the political elite to tradespeople. Pliny's Natural Histories tells us, for instance, that Sulla wore a signet ring depicting the surrender of Jugurtha, and Augustus wore one with a sphinx. Similarly, papyrological evidence indicates a variety of peoples throughout the Mediterranean who also used sealstones, based on the archives found at Zenon and Delos. Intaglios with theatrical subjects were manufactured from the early Hellenistic period onwards. However, production reached its peak during the late Republic and early Empire. Although the dating of gems is a notorious problem, many pieces, and particularly the copies in glass paste, so there is a distinction between sort of precious stones and then the slightly cheaper examples made of a glass paste, these can be plausibly dated to around about the turn of the 1st century BC into the 1st century CE. This date range is not infallible, and there are some stylistic changes which can be observed and which probably occurred over a slightly longer period of time. But nevertheless, it does remain a plausible date to consider the majority of gems as belonging to this period of the 1st century BC and CE. Intaglios are likewise quite difficult to provenance due to the practices of collecting that was adopted by medieval and early modern gem collectors. However, the extant evidence does seem to suggest that the production of intaglios was particularly concentrated in southern Italy. A variety of comic masks are represented on these intaglios, and some are very clearly articulated. So on the slide are 4 examples out of the many that I could have selected to demonstrate this particular object, but these are some of the clearest and the easiest to see what's being represented. In the top right, we have an oval purple-brown glass paste intaglio with iridescent patches, and it depicts 2 comic masks. One is a slave character, which we can tell based on the wide mouth, which is known as the trumpet mouth or the trumpet beard, and also his bald head, which identifies it as a cook mask. And then also the mask of a young male character, perhaps the character known as the admirable young man. Identifying mask names and mask types is very dependent on the text of a writer called Pollux of Naucratis, and the exact relationship between that text, which gives an index of different mask types, and the visual record is something that I can discuss further if it is of interest in the question portion of the talk today, because it is quite an interesting relationship. But for now, it's all of the terms that I use throughout the talk will be based on the mask names that are given in that particular text. The 2 green examples on the slide also both have 2 comic masks shown, and the one on the left-hand side is probably one of my favorite examples. It is marked out as a particularly intricate scene and is a very fine piece of artwork. The playwright, it shows some actors and probably a playwright. The playwright can be seen seated, looking at a mask that he holds on his lap. One actor stands behind him with his mask pushed back, and another stands in front of them holding a script in front of him, which he seems to be reading off. He also has a mask pushed back, and he seems to be in the process of rehearsing. All around them are masks, some on top of the pillar behind the seated figure, and some scattered around the floor. Both the material and the intricacy of the rendering indicate that this was an expensive piece of functional jewelry. Moving on to the second most common category of object, which depicts the comic mask, we find figurines. Ranging from approximately 10 to 30 centimeters in height, theatrical figurines were molded, sculpted, and formed into the shape of masked actors playing a specific character. Between about 250 and 150 BC, figurines were primarily made of terracotta, and production and distribution was mainly concentrated in Greece and the Greek islands. After 150 BC reduces, and there was only a limited production of these sorts of figurines in the Italic Peninsula, with most of this production happening in Etruria, specific towns within central Italy, and specific towns in Sicily. On the other hand, terracotta figurines are not produced as frequently in Campania after this point, which does mark it out quite considerably from earlier periods where terracotta was much more popular. Instead, most of the production of figurines in the Italic Peninsula switches to bronze. This is particularly the case in central Italy, and there seems to be an overwhelming preference for much finer quality materials. On the slide is a set of 4 terracotta figurines, and these were found in a grave in Tarquinia, although they have been incorrectly recorded for many years as coming from Canino. However, it's now possible to say that they actually come from Tarquinia, based on a very old Italian record of the excavation in the 1800s. Using the masks to identify each character, the figurines represented from left to right are a cook holding a wineskin, a parasite or flatterer character, a young male character who perhaps is a rustic character, and then another cook character. Based on the British Museum acquisition notes, there may also have been a figurine of a scribe that belonged to this group, but this figurine does now seem to have been lost. Both these examples and the example that you can now see on the slide come from central Italy. However, in this case, this is a much more expensive and much finer quality example. It shows a slave character seated on an altar. The slave seated on the altar is a very, very popular image and has a very long history. And again, is something that I could expand on further if it is of interest. This image doesn't really capture just how large this figurine is. It's about 60 centimeters in height. And as I said, it's made from very fine quality marble and was found on the Caelian Hill in Rome. Again, a very careful reconstruction of the acquisition history suggests that this statuette was part of a pair, with the accompanying statuette representing the leading old man character from comic performances. It is likely, therefore, that perhaps there were 2. These would be part of a set with the slave sat on the altar and an old man character, which perhaps would have been on either side of a doorway in a domestic setting. Another set comes from Pompeii, and they were found, it's a male character and a female character, and they were found on either side of a doorway in a garden in Pompeii. So it does suggest that perhaps it was fashionable to have these statuettes flanking doorways as part of domestic decoration. An equally large category of material is replica masks, which were also made of materials such as terracotta, marble, and bronze. Replica masks can be defined as objects which were modeled or sculpted to replicate the appearance of theatrical masks. The terracotta examples from this period are primarily found in grave contexts and can be considered grave goods selected to be buried with the deceased. Frequently, these terracottas have visible holes on either side for suspension, which would suggest that they were also hung up as decorative ornaments. The example on the left hand of the slide is a terracotta example, and unfortunately you can't see it in this image, but there are 2 holes at the back which would have been used for suspension. The example on the right is made of marble, and also, as you can see, it has the iron ring at the top to allow it to be hung up as some kind of decorative display. The stone replica masks are also likely to have been of substantial size, and I'll talk about a couple of examples of much larger size in a moment, but the majority of them are approximately life-size. These life-size masks have prompted a somewhat surprising debate about whether or not they would have been worn, a suggestion that can be quite quickly discounted simply by picking one up and feeling its weight. These decorative replica masks are closely related to another category of material, which is architectural decoration. This category refers to masks that are represented in relief, either made of terracotta or marble, and used to decorate public or private buildings. In the case of terracotta reliefs, these continue to be manufactured in the Italian peninsula, especially in central Italy and Campania from 50 BC to 50 CE, despite the production of terracotta figurines significantly declining. These reliefs often depicted masked actors engaged in standard comic scenes, and indeed the same scene can be seen reoccurring on 4 separate terracotta relief panels, one of which was discovered in Italy and the rest were scattered around the Mediterranean. An illustrated reconstruction of this scene can be seen on the slide, as well as an image of one of the 4 fragments which show this scene, and this is the fragment that comes from Italy. Although each fragment comes from a different mold series and does have a slightly different version of the scene, we can be certain that it is the same scene that is being represented. A slave seeks refuge on an altar in front of a house, and an angry old man rushes towards him, whilst another old man stands between them, evidently trying to mediate the situation. The scene is reminiscent of the final scene of Plautus's Mostellaria and indicates a shared iconographic culture of mask representation across a wide geographic area in this period. Marble masks in relief likewise demonstrate a shared stylistic tradition with different extant panels exhibiting the same types of design. As architectural reliefs, these panels would have been used to decorate a variety of spaces, including theatre buildings. Where material culture has been recovered through the excavation of Roman theatres, it is clear that these theatres were decorated with the images of masks. An example can be the Theatre of Verona, where masks in relief were used to decorate the interior of the building, and also the theatre in Ostia, where there are masks in relief on the exterior, based on the excavations. The most compelling example are the monumental masks that adorned the Theatre of Marcellus in the Campus Martius of Rome. Building work was most likely planned for this theatre during the period of Julius Caesar and was completed between 13 and 11 BCE when it was inaugurated by Augustus, before being named for the emperor's nephew, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, in 23 BCE. Around the theatre's exterior were displayed a series of colossal masks, which were affixed to the keystones of the facade with iron clamps. And if both the Doric and Ionic orders were so decorated, and it does seem very likely that both were, then there could have been up to 82 representations of masks around the entire perimeter of the theatre. In contrast to the previous examples we have seen, these masks were on a monumental scale and decorated an important public building commissioned and named after the leading politicians of the late Republic and early Empire. This should give an indication that this is not only a popular image, but also had political significance. Another type of architectural decoration were antefixes, which were made of both terracotta and marble into the shape of comic masks. These antefixes were ornamental covers that were used to conceal the end of tiles along the edges of roofs, and they were especially pervasive in southern Italy and in Sicily, particularly from an early period. From their high vantage point, these leering masks would have looked down from the tops of roofs in much the same way as gargoyles look from Christian churches. A relevant comparison can be drawn to the use of Medusa for antefixes in southern Italy, which likewise took a well-known and compelling image and used it to decorate the exterior of buildings. Similar to the antefixes are a few extant Roman drain pipes, which were cast to resemble open-mouthed slave masks. Sculpted with close attention to detail, these bronze masks seem to have allowed water to flow out of the mouth and onto the street below or into the house, depending. Unfortunately, we don't have any specific contextual information for this example. So we don't know exactly which building it might have been part of, but based on its construction, we can reconstruct what the viewing context might have been and what the function of this object would have been. Functionality is likewise a defining characteristic of an equally large category of objects, which are domestic utensils. This is actually my favorite category of objects, and it can be defined as any object that has a practical function within a domestic or a votive context. So this includes knives, lamps, incense burners, and even a baby's feeding bottle. These items tend to be one-off, although this could just be the result of what has survived. But it is possible that we're looking at more bespoke pieces that perhaps show specific tastes of the individual as well as a general trend. This is more likely to be the case for objects made of more expensive materials. One example is a famous collection of silverware found in the house of Menander in Pompeii, dating to the 1st century CE, which includes 2 cups where, along with 2 mythical scenes, a series of comic and tragic masks are used as a decorative motif. Cheaper examples, however, such as 2 terracotta hemispherical relief bowls decorated with masks, one comes from Lazio and one from Tuscany, but both have a very similar design, likely indicate the production of functional objects for a much larger mass market. On the slide, some of the examples I've chosen From the top left-hand corner is a bronze knife handle, which is in the shape of an actor playing the leading slave character. Next to that are two examples of lamps. One is in bronze and is shaped into a slave mask again. And next to that is a terracotta example. And rather than being shaped into the mask is used as the decoration for this particular lamp. The mouth of the mask is repurposed to act as a hole, an air hole for the lamp. Underneath those, you can see an incense burner, which is shaped into a comic slave actor sat on an altar. So the same imagery as we saw previously with the marble example. However, this is a smaller example made of terracotta. With the image showing the back of the figurine, we can see the air holes and an air hole at the side as well. The final example on the slide on the left is a feeding bottle, perhaps for a baby or perhaps for someone who was sick. And again, it's decorated with what could be either a slave mask or an old man mask. The slave mask and old man mask tend to merge together from about the 1st century BC and become slightly hard to distinguish from each other. But nevertheless, it is clearly a comic slave mask decorating a feeding bottle. Returning to the masks of being used as architectural decoration, however, we come to masks that are painted as part of frescoes. The majority of these that survive come from Pompeii, although there are a few examples from central Italy. Images range from comic scenes, such as the architectural terracotta panels that were discussed previously, to masks that are being used as decorative borders. This latter subcategory became popular in the peninsula after 150 BCE, and the style is reminiscent of those produced on Delos during the same period, demonstrating the close stylistic ties between the South Italy and the Aegean in this period. Masks as decorative motif, however, remained popular in the peninsula well into the 1st century CE. One of the best examples comes from the triclinium of one of the most opulent houses in Pompeii, the House of the Golden Bracelet. Dating to the early 1st century CE, the wall painting on the slide is one of the several that surrounded the triclinium and which depicts a garden filled with dozens of local species of plants and birds, a bird bath, herms supporting plaques showing sleeping women, and 2 theatre masks hanging from the top of the scene. This painting, and others like it, prompt a series of questions about the use of mask imagery in the context of wealthy homes. For example, the 2 masks in this case are most likely tragic masks rather than comic masks. So we can ask questions about why certain types of masks would have been used in certain contexts. A very similar type category, and also a category that's dominated by Pompeian material, are the floor and wall mosaics, which also depict masks. Here again, masks are either represented as part of a comic scene or as a decorative border. Like architectural reliefs, the scenes selected to decorate the homes of the Italic Peninsula seem to have been connected to Greek New Comedy and are consistent with what was popular across the Mediterranean. An example from Pompeii, which dates to around about 100 BCE, is a mosaic that was discovered in the so-called House of Cicero. The mosaic depicts a scene from Menander's play, The Demonic or Possessed Girl, and it's the work of a very prolific artist, Dioscorides of Samos, and you can see his name written at the top of the mosaic. It's comparable to a similar scene with an inscription from the House of Menander from a Greek island, which dates to the century before. That particular mosaic has a very similar scene, which is labeled with the play that it comes from, so we can be certain that this scene is a representation of Menander's play. 3 street musicians play outside a house, 2 wearing the masks of young men, and 1 the mask of a woman, by whose side stands a young unmasked boy. Notably, when a character is represented unmasked, as we can see here, it tends to mean that it is a representation of a non-speaking role. In the play that is being represented, the musicians are trying to lure the possessed girl out of the house by playing the music of the mother goddess. These scenes display a very high quality of craftsmanship, and much like the rest of the material in this data set, belong to a much wider trend of mask representation in the visual record in this period. The other example on the slide is a slightly less fine example, but it's just to give you a sense of the fact that it can be used as scenes, but it can also just be one-off mask imagery. This example is one of a set, and different mask types are represented in their own panels. And these ones come from central Italy rather than from Pompeii. The penultimate category to introduce you to, and also perhaps a slightly surprising category, is jewelry. This includes objects such as bracelets, rings, necklaces, and earrings. Many are made of very precious metals, and the examples that do survive are often examples of fine craftsmanship, and we can be relatively certain that we are looking at objects that were at least carefully selected, if not personally commissioned. Masks on jewelry can be found from an early period, but there seems to have been an increased interest from the 1st century BCE. This trend most likely belongs to the broader trend, also identifiable in the figurine production, where fine materials were becoming increasingly popular. Like intaglios, contextual information is very hard to find for jewelry. However, where there is an archaeological context, it does most commonly come from grave contexts. Much of the jewelry would have belonged to women, and a recurring motif is the presence not only of the comic mask, but also depictions of Eros holding a comic mask, a combination which is deserving of further study. The example on the right hand of the slide is just such a pendant. It shows Eros with a sash passing across his back and twisted around his arm, and in his left hand he holds a plaque embossed with a comic mask. The necklace itself is gold-plated. I apologize that it is a black and white image. I haven't been able to get hold of a color one yet, but it is quite a bright gold when you see it in person. It dates from the 1st century CE, and unfortunately there is no contextual information which reveal either where it was made or found. On the left-hand side is a ring which is made of bone, and this comes from Lazio in the center of the peninsula. It is of an earlier date than the necklace, around the 2nd half of the 2nd century BCE. The eye and the mouth of the mask's face are hollowed out to give the image its expressive appearance, and the face is framed with both hair and a wreath around the top of the mask's head. The final category of objects on which the mask is displayed is funerary monuments, where we find masks on headstones, altars, cinerary urns, and sarcophagi. The presence of this imagery does not, however, always denote that the deceased was connected to or worked in the theatre, which has been previously assumed by scholars. Indeed, in many cases, the selection of masks for funerary monuments seems to have been based on stylistic considerations. The majority of these examples from this period come from the Veneto, which may be the result of chance survival rather than being indicative of a broader trend. Roman sarcophagi decorated with masks becomes particularly popular after 50 CE, but the trend is identifiable earlier during the late Republican period. These funerary monuments are perhaps easier to handle in terms of their context, as being used to mark a final resting place of the deceased. The context in which the object was viewed is relatively clear. By working through these examples, I hope it has become clear the extraordinary breadth of material upon which the comic mask is found, and the versatility of the image. From monumental masks to drain pipes to incense burners to small pieces of delicate jewelry, the mask is a dominant image, and therefore, as my thesis will argue, is deserving of detailed study. In an article published in 1975, C. Argan concluded his thoughts on the relationship between iconography and ideology with the following statement: "The image which is worn out, consumed, rectified for the 1000th time, or deformed by the careless habit by which it has been adapted to the most varied occasions, is often much more eloquent for the historian of the image than the scholarly, purified, controlled version, which is established by the lucid structure of a formal system. Nowhere is this more true, in my opinion, than in the case of the comic mask in the Roman visual record. The image of the comic mask can be found on a breadth of objects and in a variety of contexts, for which the mask seems to have been repurposed and reformed each time. The images range from being mass-produced in terracotta and bronze to skillfully crafted on marble and on precious gemstones. The ubiquity of the image, its apparently various functionality, and the worn-out nature of the image does indeed, as Argan points out, tell the historian much more than if the image of the comic mask only appeared in a series of very carefully controlled and restricted places. Rather than being the provenance of a particular group of the population or of a particular wealth bracket, instead, it seems to be an image that moves across social boundaries, decorating wealthy homes, public buildings, and also small, insignificant graves. Rather than this diminishing the meaning of the image, the quantity of material and its quality, as well as the occurrence of the image, serves to demonstrate its significance. When we think of the Italic Peninsula during this period, we should think of a world covered with the decorative image of the comic mask. Thank you very much for listening.